it's important that you have faith that I'm an elephant, a real life, actual elephant with a real trunk here. Will you do it? Will you have faith that I'm an elephant? Well, if you're having trouble, let me offer you $1 million. Would you have faith that I'm an elephant for $1 million? Could you do it? Could you have faith that I'm an actual elephant if the reward is high enough? Well, maybe that depends on what we mean by faith. What I see is that there's a lot of confusion over what faith even means. There's a notion of faith that I think actually blocks insight. It's a problematic notion of faith. Then there's another notion of faith that I think is based in insight. Unfortunately, the problematic notion of faith not only blocks insight, but it blocks awareness of this more virtuous form of faith that I want to talk about. But first, let me talk about a problematic notion of faith that I see. Maybe you can relate to this. Have you ever had a friend who's a believer in something? Maybe they believe that God exists, and you ask them, why do you believe that? You're a truth seeker. You want to face reality. You want to build your beliefs about the world on reliable evidence, evidence that gives you beliefs that match reality itself. So you ask your friend, what is the evidence for your belief in God? Now maybe they offer some personal experiences, maybe they give you an argument, and then you continue the conversation. You analyze the argument with them, you provide them another way to interpret those experiences, and after a while your friend seems to grow impatient, and they eventually respond saying something like this: hey buddy, you have to just have faith. This isn't something that you can understand through reason or evidence. God goes beyond reason and evidence. You just have to have faith. Now, if you've had this experience, it might invite a little worry inside of you, especially if you're a truth seeker and you want to know what's actually true. Consider proposition P. P is either true, it either matches reality or it doesn't. Now, if it doesn't match reality and there's no evidence for P, merely choosing to believe in P, if you even could do that, is not going to make P more likely to be true. Why have faith that P is true rather than that P is false? Well, if you're a truth seeker, the mere faith, which is a kind of a leap in the dark beyond or without evidence, isn't going to help you to get to truth. In fact, it's going to block insight. This reminds me of a while back I was experimenting with trading stocks, and I was just a complete novice, and I had some money and I just put it in there, and I noticed that I had this strong desire to see the stock go up. So I began to look on the internet for news that would support that the stock is going to rise. And I was scanning for evidence that would support this belief, but I was discounting evidence that would disconfirm the belief. Really, it wasn't a belief, it was just a hope. I was having faith. Well, that faith actually led me away from reality. Turned out that stock went down. Eventually, I just pulled out. It kept going down. It was good that I eventually did come out instead of maintaining a belief that leads to a dangerous mismatch between reality and what I have faith in. Right? I mean, don't you want to have faith that matches reality? Well, you don't even want to have faith if it's based on believing in something that meets emotional needs rather than meets the needs of what reality is actually like. So I think this form of faith actually does block insight and inspires skepticism. Now, what if you're a skeptic of God and your friend not only says you need to have faith, but if you don't have faith, if you don't believe in God without any reason or evidence or any basis, you're going to be condemned, or you're going to miss out on some goods. It's bad. You're a bad person for not believing, for being skeptical. Well, I can't speak for you, but for myself, I would feel even more worried. That would pull me away from wanting to be anything like this person who's believing in such an irresponsible way. I think this is a recipe for producing skeptics in any proposition. I'm using the proposition that God exists because I think this is one that many people can relate to personally. Even theists who were theists are no longer theists because their community seemed to believe in God on faith without reason or evidence. And that's a problem. Now, I used to be more disturbed by this sort of conversation where a believer in X doesn't articulate evidence for X, but they continue to believe in X. Until I realized that people naturally believe in far more than they know what their evidence is. For example, my kids believe that I'm their dad and that there is an external world, that they're not the only person hooked up to a machine that's pumping them with their experiences to believe in other persons besides themselves. Right? They believe that there's other people. But why? What's their argument? What's their evidence for that? Well, they don't have one. I've asked them this, like, well, how do you know that I'm your dad? Like, I don't know, I just do, right? Well, of course, you know more than you know that you know, right? If in order to know something, you had to know how you knew it, then in order to know one thing, you'd have to know how you know that, and then you have to know how you know that, and it's going to go to infinity, so you have to have an infinite amount of knowledge to know anything. Nobody has an infinite amount of knowledge, therefore nobody knows anything. No, you know something, therefore you don't have to know how you know in order to know. Okay, so I do think that happens sometimes when people have beliefs, and maybe they just call that faith. You know, it's sort of a belief, but they don't know how they know it, and so they just call that faith. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about something that I think is really based on actual insight. And maybe you wouldn't want to use the term faith, but I think you could use the term faith to talk about an insight that's based on an inference that goes beyond what's in our immediate experience. So I'm inferring, for example, that you exist, okay? But I don't actually immediately experience you. You're inferring that I exist. You're not experiencing me, you're experiencing a video, right? And that inference is guided by sort of an invisible thought that there's something beyond your experiences. It's not that the invisible thought's not justified or not reasonable, it is. It's just that it takes a little more energy to focus on the invisible inferences than to focus on what's immediate, what's obvious. And this can be tested and stretched and even strengthened when it goes across time and the inferences aren't quite so easy. For example, I have knowledge that I have a wife, and I have knowledge that it's good for me to protect my relationship with my wife. I have knowledge of this. I've got reasons that support that knowledge. But there can be moments where I'm tempted to be unfaithful to her. But I don't have to do that, right? I don't have to be pulled along by the immediate, by the obvious. Because I can also use my mind, this sort of strength of reason, and follow inferences back to what I know to be true, which is the value of protecting this valuable relationship, and why being faithful to her is actually going to bring me greater happiness in the long term and to her. And that's a good thing to do. Another example would be faithfulness to contracts. One of my accountant friends told me that societies where contracts are regularly broken tend not to do very well economically, while societies where contracts tend to be kept and enforced, those are societies that tend to flourish much more economically. And that kind of makes sense. You could see why that would be. But what does it take to keep a contract? I mean, maybe in the initial signing of the contract, you can see fingers moving and mouths moving as you're verbally expressing the terms. But when you remember that contract, you're remembering a commitment between persons. And you no longer have any visible experience of the nature of the contract. You're maintaining the value of the contract by your awareness of invisible goods that you apprehend through inference and through reason. And it takes energy to do that. It takes energy to remember the value of a contract when there are other pressures on you. Maybe pressures to buy something else that would give you more immediate satisfaction, rather than maintaining the value of that contract, which will help your future self, but maybe is harder on your present self. It takes a kind of virtue, a kind of a strength, a kind of intellectual energy to build knowledge of the world, rather than to merely be skeptical and to cut down things and to not believe in anything, but to actually see a sound basis for knowledge, and then to maintain that in the face of the sort of tides of present experience. I'm talking about actual knowledge, where you know that it's good for you and for your family to keep that contract, where you actually know that it's good to be faithful to your significant other, and you have good knowledge of this based on actual reason and evidence. My main point in this video is to suggest that although there is this problematic notion of faith where it's leaping into the dark, following a stock and hoping that it succeeds, meeting your emotional needs rather than facing reality, there's another notion of faith that I think is quite virtuous. It's what you find when you're faithful to contracts, you're faithful to your marriage, you're faithful to things that you do actually know to be true, but the basis of that knowledge requires a kind of intellectual energy. It requires a remembering of experiences or a focusing on inferences. It's not just immediately obvious, and so it takes strength, takes courage, takes virtue to maintain that knowledge that you do actually have. And so when you're thinking about faith, you might think about blind faith and associate that with religion. And then you're going to be skeptical of religion. But there's this other way of approaching the world that takes virtue, takes energy. It's a way of seeing past the immediate, obvious things that are present before your eyes and remembering reasons for things that take you to the value of contracts, the value of invisible realities that you do have reason to believe in, that in fact you have insight into. But it takes an energy of the soul to carry those in you. And when you can do that, it actually can be a platform for building more knowledge,